So my name's Liz David-Barrett, and I'm going to be moderating the session this afternoon. We are, in fact, going to start with a presentation from Kaunain Rahman and Antonio Greco, and they are going to introduce the new Integrity Pact standard. So we're going to hear from them first, and then we are going to move on to our expert panel. We're going to hear a few minutes from each of our panelists. Then we'll open up to questions and answers. And then we would also like to hear throughout from anyone here who's here from a TI chapter or has had any other involvement in actually implementing integrity pacts. So please, we would love to hear about your experiences, what went well, what went wrong, etc. So I will hand over now to Kaya and Antonio.
Oh, wow, that is loud. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kaunain Rahman, the Business Integrity Specialist at Transparency International Secretariat, and I warmly welcome each one of you to the workshop on the Integrity Pact, a global collective action standard for safeguarding strategic public investments. Many thanks, especially to the Siemens Integrity Initiative for all their support. And before we begin, I know we've all had lunch and we're feeling a bit low on energy, so let's do a vocal exercise for the next few seconds. When I say go, I want you to shout out one word that comes to your mind when I say integrity pacts. So mind you, this is after lunch. Be as loud and as creative as you want. So are you ready? Yeah? 1, 2, 3, integrity pacts. Let's do it one more time because I'm deaf in one ear. Integrity pacts. Love that. Okay. So I heard many terms and a lot of jumbled terms as well, but we are going to explore all of that through the course of this session. So in terms of integrity pacts, what are they? So through extensive consultations with TI chapters, governments, international organizations, and civil society representatives, Transparency International, TI, defined the broad lines of the Integrity Pact concept in the 1990s. As Gen Z would say, it is one of our OG tools. So the general idea behind the integrity pacts is that public authorities and private firms involved in a public contracting project mutually commit through a binding agreement to refrain from corruption and collusion. And an independent monitor, ideally a civil society organization, ensures that those commitments are upheld. The concept of integrity pacts have evolved through its various implementations over the decades, and we at TI are currently in the process of developing a new global integrity pact standard that explores the minimum common denominators that are required for an IP, an integrity pact, to be an integrity pact, as well as exploring the highly desirable elements that ought to be included in the various models and variations in its implementation. So the aim of today's workshop is, therefore, to be a feedback session for us to debate and gather all of our collective knowledge as we work towards launching this global standard next year. And I now invite my colleague, Antonio Greco, Public Contracting Specialist at TI, to give us more details. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. So I think, well, Kaunain summed it up pretty well. The concept of the Integrity Pact is very general, and in the last 20, 30 years, it has been applied in around 30 countries all over the world, in 4 different regions, and there's been really a lot of variations like how it has been implemented. So first of all, it has been applied in any types of contracts, starting from procurement of medicines and textbooks to large infrastructure projects, and so on. So really here we have a very large sort of range of contracts and flexibility. It also the implementation trends have also varied a lot. In some countries, it has been implemented as a systematic way of monitoring a large group of contracting projects. In other countries, it has even become an object of the law. It has been incorporated in the law. And in other countries still, it has been implemented as a sort of systematic collective action initiative, so including a wide range of stakeholders over a long period of time. Throughout all these applications, the Integrity Pact has had a lot of benefits, including, for example, better procurement governance, early detection of irregularities and resolution, and therefore a smoother implementation of projects. Also, we have seen in some projects greater involvement of affected communities, which is a very important aspect, especially when it comes to large and complex infrastructure projects, as well as business integrity. But the way in which those benefits came about, they have varied a lot, depending on the implementation context and how different actors have come together to sort of implement the Integrity Pacts as a type of collective action initiatives. On the one hand, the fact that it was implemented in so many countries is a demonstration that the Integrity Pact is very flexible. On the other hand, though, over the time, there's been also a lot of variation in how it has been interpreted and understood in different countries. One of the most common misconceptions was that of equating the Integrity Pact to a simple anti-corruption declaration without involving any civil society organization in the monitoring, and therefore, in many cases, it also became sort of just another document to sign upon the contracting process. And this even happened in countries which have actually recognized it formally in the legislation. So that was one of the main issues. Another key challenge, especially in recent times, has been the lack of business engagement, especially when it comes to designing the Integrity Pacts. And sort of having this sort of communication and trust during the procurement process. Paradoxically, this was much more common in earlier Integrity Pacts in the 90s and 2000s, while more recently it has become more sort of a way for civil society organization to directly monitor the procurement process. Another problem has been that there has been no uniform way of actually measuring the impacts of the Integrity Pacts, and therefore a lot of potential knowledge and lessons learned have been sort of lost throughout the way. So we have more like sparse sort of examples of benefits of the Integrity Pacts, but no way of measuring this in a uniform way. So nowadays, the Integrity Pacts, of course, we are in a very different context. In the 90s, the anti-corruption as a policy field was still in its infancy, and the Integrity Pacts actually was one of the very first anti-corruption tools. Today, the context has much changed. We live in a globalized world. There is a lot of pressure on governments to deliver on sustainable development goals. Public contracting itself has become much more complex and relevant. And also today we have much more developed anti-corruption policies across different countries. So what we wanted to do by developing a new global Integrity Pact standard was to not to change anything like radically about any radical feature of the Integrity Pacts, but rather to incorporate the lessons of 20 years of implementation across different countries and develop a model that can work more or less in any context, but which on the one hand has some minimum standards that should be present in every Integrity Pact, but at the same time that can allow for flexibility and innovation at the national level. So of course, there is no time to talk about implementation in single countries, even though we will have the opportunity to hear from chapters which are present here about their experiences. But you can check out our Global Integrity Pacts Compendium, which incorporates, which provides detailed overviews of how Integrity Pacts was implemented and varied across different countries. That's available in our website, and therefore you can learn more throughout that. So coming to the new Integrity Pact standard, so our main initial idea was to first of all have some conceptual clarity regarding what an Integrity Pact is, because as I said, the main problem of equating the integrity pacts to a simple agreement was that many governments have intended it only as a bilateral thing between public contracting authorities and bidders. So to overcome sort of this conceptual unclarity, we would rather define the integrity pacts as a type of multi-stakeholder collective action initiative, which brings together public authorities, civil society, and private sector, and whose main goal is to contribute to the open, accountable, effective, and inclusive implementation of a public contracting project. So the key point is that the pact itself is not anymore between the public sector and the private sector, but it also includes a third party, which is very important, which is civil society, which represents affected community in the contracting process. So that's like from a conceptual point of view. Coming to the specific structure of the integrity pacts, we have 4 key elements which should be present in every integrity pact, which is a binding agreement through which the relationship between different parties is formalized, a set of commitments and activities across different areas, an independent monitoring mechanism that should be led by civil society, and also a set of grievance mechanisms. And for all these 4 elements, there are some what we would call model variables, which are things that can vary according to the different country, implementation context, or even contracting projects. There are several different ways. So our idea is that of providing a blueprint through which different countries and implementers can model their integrity pacts. And this can vary a lot, like depending on what are the different features of these elements. For example, we have, when it comes to the binding agreements, people will have to decide about who are the participants, what are the documents to be used, whether the signature should be mandatory or voluntary, and so on. When it comes to commitment and activities, our idea is to have a more focused, more focused domains, like on public integrity, procurement governance, access to information, data disclosure, business integrity, and social accountability. Kaunain will talk a bit more in detail about business integrity in a minute. Then about the independent monitoring mechanism, there it's very important to define some feature, for example, who is going to form the monitoring team, what is the scope of activities, whether just the monitoring of the contracting process or also implementation of other activities, what is the coverage, so the different phases of the contracting process, the access to confidential information, and also sort of ways of reporting to the public, which is a very important function of the monitor. And also the monitor must have a possibility to withdraw from the process if it sees that it cannot go on anymore. And last but not least, the Integrity Pact should also have some grievance mechanisms, which are designed to address corruption and irregularities that might be brought up by actors during the process. So there should be clear procedures for doing that, along with dispute resolution mechanism, which is always constructive, never repressive. So the point here is to resolve disputes in an amicable manner, and if that is not possible, to go through the normal judicial means of a country. And sanctions, which in the history of integrity pacts, actually, they've been applied very little, but nevertheless, the implementers might want to sort of raise the bar through that. So now I'll hand over back to Kaunain, who will talk you a bit more in detail about the business integrity features. Thank you.
So, business integrity. When it comes to successful integrity pacts, business integrity is both a means and an end. It is a means to ensure that commitments of integrity pacts are upheld, and through the success of integrity pacts, we also get the added advantage of bolstering integrity in the overall business climate of a particular context. Next up, as my colleague Antonio mentioned just a few minutes ago, one challenge with integrity pacts in recent times have been limited engagement of businesses, which, as he mentioned, is quite paradoxical, as through the 90s and 2000s, in the initial years of the integrity pacts, businesses were active stakeholders. And in terms of actually getting businesses to be more engaged and IPs to actually be initiated by businesses, it is important to reflect on the incentives and mechanisms for their participation. And these can be through whitelists or point systems or any novel ideas that one of you in the crowd can suggest later in our discussions. Another crucial point is that integrity pacts can offer a learning space for both bidders and contractors. It especially contributes to enhanced access to the procurement market for small and medium enterprises who often don't have the bandwidth and resources to compete with larger firms who tend to have their inbuilt compliance systems. And thereby, it reduces, to a large extent, the cost of anti-corruption for smaller businesses, something I know all too well of having worked in these firms with these firms in the Global South. So thus, thus integrity pacts and thus business integrity and integrity pacts are inextricably linked, and they ensure fair competition, trust, no corruption, and collective action in the integrity pact process. So when it comes to business integrity and integrity pacts, there are some absolute basic components that need to be there, need to be included for business integrity to be included in integrity pacts. And these are, of course, the anti-bribery and anti-collusion pledges and the disclosure of payments to intermediaries. However, these are just the basics. These are just the elemental features, right? So with the progressing and evolving anti-corruption landscape, yeah, okay. With this wider landscape and the wide variety of tools that we now have at our disposal, for a meaningful fostering of business integrity and integrity pacts, we need more than just these basic elements. So for instance, we can have whistleblowing mechanisms. We can have the adoption of codes of ethics and compliance programs. We can have adoption of international standards on business integrity and corporate governance, and ESG reporting and disclosure of corporate integrity data, right? So these are, although these elements are highly desirable, there's a deep need for these elements to now be included in business integrity in integrity pacts, right? So speaking of the way forward and key discussion points, so in the process of putting this new global standard together, we've identified some areas that we would particularly want your feedback on. So first, how do we make integrity part of a broader ecosystem for public spending monitoring? How do we conduct strategic policy-oriented application and project selection that link integrity pacts to the fulfillment of the SDGs? How do we enhance collaboration between stakeholders of an integrity pact and move out of just the zone of public authorities initiating integrity pacts? How do we measure impact? And how do we ensure scalability and sustainability? So while all of you ponder on these points, I now hand over the session back to the experts and to please kick off the discussion. Thank you very much. Liz, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that great introduction to the new Integrity Pact standard. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to introduce the session and we're going to hear from some of our experts. I just wanted to reflect a little bit. So I'm an academic and I came to this topic because I was doing research actually when the UK was introducing the Bribery Act. And so I started to do some research with companies and asking them about the circumstances in which they paid bribes. And I went into it thinking companies are the bad guys. And actually, what I started to find in my research was that often companies felt that they were really forced into a position where they had to pay bribes in order to be able to function. So many of them felt more like victims than bad guys. So I thought this is interesting. Actually, you've got all these companies that would really like to be operating in a context which is clean, where they don't have to pay bribes. But how do they get to that context? How do they get to that different equilibrium? And that's when I realized that this is a collective action problem. So a classic case, everybody wants to get to this different equilibrium where you don't have to pay bribes. But as an individual company, that doesn't make sense because it's costly to start being the one who says, okay, I'm going to stop paying. What's going to happen? You're just not going to win any business. Yeah. You also think there's really no point because I'm not going to get any benefit from this. And of course, if every company thinks like that, then nobody is going to act and you're never going to achieve that situation of getting to the new equilibrium. So the solution that comes from theory to this is from club theory. And this says that actually you can get this collective action to work, but only if the 3 conditions are fulfilled. The first one is that you start to form a club and there's got to be some cost to joining that club. So it's not an empty commitment, it's got to be a credible commitment. So I find that really interesting in the Integrity Pact standard here. They've got here that you've got to make a pledge. You've got to stand up and say that you're not going to pay bribes. So that's, in a way, that's a cost that you're imposing on yourself, as well as commitment to reporting. So that's the first condition. Second condition is there've got to be some selective benefits to being in the club. Some benefits that you only get if you're in the club. So one of the problems when you think about the collective action problem is you think to yourself, why would I stop paying bribes? Why would I join this movement? Because actually, if everybody else joins that movement, then I'll get the benefit of moving to that clean environment, even if I didn't incur the cost of taking part. So with the club, you've got to say that there are some benefits that you only get if you're in the club. And then thirdly, you've got to have some kind of monitoring that people actually stick to their commitments and sanctions if they don't. And I think that's also a really interesting point for me about integrity pacts, that there is this monitoring, actors holding each other to account, and that multi-stakeholder structure is really important. So interesting for me to see the theory sort of come alive in the standard that you've produced. But I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to hand over to Peter Eigen. Of course, Peter, the founder and father of the TI movement. Peter, could you tell us a little bit about the context in which you came up with the idea of integrity pacts? What did it look like then, and why did it seem like a good idea? And maybe if you could just reflect on how that context has changed and how you see the role of integrity pacts now.
Thank you very much. This is really a great pleasure for me to talk to you and to talk about this concept of the Integrity Pact, because this concept was basically key to our success in the past. At the very beginning, when I started to rally about the idea to do something about corruption, I introduced ideas about the Integrity Pact. Before the meeting, during the meeting, after the meetings, in particular when the OECD began to work for a draft convention against foreign bribery, the Integrity Pact was always there. It was not as clearly defined as we just heard here. I should say about myself, I'm not really an expert. I never saw myself as an expert, more like an activist who was trying very hard. But I was in charge of procurement in the legal department of the World Bank for a couple of years. Each of our World Bank projects had a very important requirement of the recipients of the loans of the World Bank to give contracts out after competitive bidding. And I spent about 5 years in the legal department just working on that issue. Therefore, it came very naturally to me when about 20 years later, when I had moved out of the legal department, I was basically the director of East Africa in Nairobi in the World Bank office there. When I started to do something about corruption, because I saw many famous companies, including Siemens, bribing right hand or over fist in my countries in East Africa, and therefore basically undermining what we were trying to do in East Africa. And when I then went back to the World Bank and said we have to improve our procurement guidelines in order to say something about corruption. And I was told, no, that's not our function. Our members of the board, they don't like that. The Germans, the Brits, the French, everybody thinks that corruption is inherent in international business, and therefore if we stop them from bribing, they will lose all their business internationally. So they said, if you want to fight against corruption, you better leave the bank, and that's what I did, fortunately. I moved to Berlin and started Transparency International. But the idea I began to promote among my friends in the World Bank. And so I got a lot of support of similar people like myself in the World Bank who were frustrated about the pervasiveness of corruption everywhere. And I said, we have to find a way in which everybody stops bribing simultaneously, so that this prisoner's dilemma of being the first to stop something and lose business in the process, that this is basically removed. And no other than Robert McNamara, who had just given up his presidency of the World Bank, he fell in love with this concept. And he said, if you manage to do this, I come to the launch of Transparency International. I will go with you to the World Bank and ask them to include this in their procurement guidelines. And I will travel with you all over the world to help you to basically convince people of the benefit of having an integrity pact. We didn't call it integrity pact. We called it Islands of Integrity at the time. Basically saying we don't want everybody to stop all over the world. Zero, as my friend Nico today demanded. But we want to have islands where people say, we stop in our city, in my sector, in my hospital, we start to stop bribing altogether. And this island of integrity system became basically the driving force for setting up TI in the early 90s. And so in 1993, when we actually had the founding meeting in Berlin, McNamara came and he said, I mentioned this in the earlier session, he said, Peter, if you manage to get this accepted in a country, in a major country, with some major companies like Siemens, for instance, and with some people who are participating as monitors in the civil society, I give you $10,000 out of my own pocket. And indeed, we found these people at the meeting, and it was General Electric, it was Siemens, it was a couple of other big international companies, and McNamara came, and he was touched himself and became a fantastic friend, doing basically remorse about what he had done in Vietnam. So in many ways, he was a wonderful supporter of this process. And he went into African countries, which we had to do, because the World Bank refused to allow us to include this into the procurement guidelines. They said corruption is a general phenomenon in the international marketplace, so who are we to tell other people to stop bribing? And therefore, I mean, the majority of the member countries of the World Bank didn't want it. And they more or less fired me in 1989 and said, if you want to start something like that, get out of here. And interestingly enough, quite a number of my colleagues, they had heard me talk about this a lot. In fact, I gave a speech once to a meeting, a retreat of all the resident representatives of the World Bank in Africa, in which I promoted this. And many of them said, let's do that together. But then the legal department sent me an email and said, if you want to do that, you are out. And so fortunately, I went to Berlin. And in Berlin, I promoted this idea further. And this is just to give you a sense how powerful this concept is. It is powerful mainly in the sense that it removes this prisoner's dilemma, which is really very hard for many companies to say, I'm not going to bribe in China anymore, because they have to be afraid that they will not be able to do business in a country like that. And so, jumping a couple of years, in 93 we set up TI. In 1996 we had a first conference at the Aspen Institute on the Wannsee in Berlin. And we invited Siemens, the CEO of Siemens was there. There were a lot of powerful companies, ABB, Lufthansa, a lot of General Electric, a lot of company leaders were there. And Richard von Weizsäcker, who had been the president of Germany, he chaired that meeting. And basically, the companies were afraid to meet with us because these civil society organizations are really dangerous friends to greet. So he promised and guaranteed that this would be a civilized meeting. And in the first meeting, he got so angry himself that he said he will not understand how the leaders of big business in Germany were able to defend that in Germany we allowed them to bribe outside Germany and even to deduct these payments from their taxable income. So this was a really scandalous situation, and only very few companies supported us, until we came up with this idea of the Integrity Pact. And there suddenly companies like Siemens, like General Electric and so on, they said, we are joining you because we understand that for us it is much better to have a corruption-free international market in which our quality, our reliability and so on can be an advantage in competing with others rather than competing through corruption. And in the fall of 1993, in fact I see Valeria Merino sitting here, we went to Quito, and at that time the vice president of Ecuador, Alberto Rajic, invited us to a farm outside Quito, and I invited Fritz Heimann, who hopefully is watching us through the internet, and some others, and we developed this concept of Integrity Pact on this farm in Ecuador even further. Valeria was at the time the head of a little NGO which agreed voluntarily to join us as one of the first chapters of Transparency International. You were the third? Okay. Don't be that transparent. So this was, this is how basically the Integrity Pact became a reality. And of course, these meetings at the Aspen Institute became very important because the business leaders who were there, including Siemens, for instance, they wrote an open letter to, at the time, Chancellor Helmut Kohl and his minister Rexroth, in which they demanded that Germany participate in the OECD convention. Germany had tried to throw me out of the deliberations for this convention. I was there many times, maybe at the invitation of the American chapter, and always criticized the German government. And so finally the minister, who was there sitting with red ears, he demanded that I should be thrown out. But the business community wrote a letter and said, Germany has to participate in this. And if Germany wouldn't have participated in this convention, we still would be in a situation where the German business community claimed they'd have to bribe if they want to do business in a globalized economy. So this open letter was absolutely fantastic, and therefore in the fall of 1997, the 35 members of the OECD and some other countries signed this fantastic convention, which basically was a threshold for tremendous improvements. So I'm telling you this because the Integrity Pact was incredibly important, and of course, over time we developed it further. The World Bank refused for a long time to include it in its procurement guidelines. In fact, they made it illegal for borrowers to restrict participation in the bidding to those companies which refused to sign the Integrity Pact, because they said one of the basic rules of government procurement under World Bank projects is that everybody from a member country of the World Bank is allowed to bid. So you cannot exclude people. So basically in our guidelines at the time, we had a phrase which, if you observe corruption in one of the bidding documents, you have to get a legal judgment in a court of justice in the country that this is corruption, and only then can you refuse to accept these bids. So this is an absolutely crazy phrase, because I mean, if President Moy accepts $20 million in order to promote a wrong project, no judge in Kisumu or even in Nairobi will dare to put him in jail. And therefore, for the World Bank to make this a requirement for even look at corruption, which was written in the procurement guidelines, which I had initially, by the way, drafted 5 years earlier, was absolutely scandalous. So the World Bank for a long time fought us, and this is why it was so important to have the former president of the World Bank travel with me and with Michael Wien, who was also a former staff member of the World Bank, traveled around in Africa and basically got the support of African presidents. They wanted to include this as an exclusion of certain bidders if they didn't sign the Integrity Pact. So this is just a bit of the background. I hope I'm not boring you with this. But we developed it further. We then adopted it, for instance, to certain sectors. So the electric power sector, for instance, was General Electric, Westinghouse, Mitsubishi, Siemens. They got together and signed a sectoral integrity pact. So that was a bit different from the definition which we heard earlier, but it held up. I mean, Professor Mark Peart at the time, who at the time didn't have the Basel Institute yet, but he supported this very much. He attended this meeting of these electric power companies, and in fact they were holding out until one of the companies discovered that the others were continuing to bribe, and so they stopped it and got out. So it was a tremendous event. We did a similar thing with the banking sector. The Wolfsburg principles came out of this as a guideline. So the Integrity Pact was the backbone of our work. But what I have to tell you also is that it can be even more useful than we thought it should be, than this prisoner's dilemma, which was a tremendous obstacle, but we also thought it could do more. And that is what the multi-stakeholder approach, which I promoted in my earlier speech, was talking about, because it can promote consensus. Because many governments would like to do the right thing, but they don't dare to do it. They don't get the support from bottom up to deal with corruption. So in many countries, there is sort of a tradition of gift giving and so on. They don't want people to play around with this. So in many ways, there has to be bottom up agreement between the major sectors of society, and that is the private sector, this is government, and this is civil society. And this is why since that time, in particular since I helped to set up the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative and helped to set up the UN Global Compact with Kofi Annan, since that time we are absolutely determined to try to include this as a major tool for fighting corruption. And therefore, I would like to end here and say this is not only good for fighting the prisoner's dilemma, this is also good for building a modicum of consensus between government, civil society, and private sector in given situations. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about this, and I hope you will all get involved in multi-stakeholder arrangements for better governance.
Thank you so much. It's really fascinating to hear about all of the legwork that went into building up integrity pacts, and also how many huge international initiatives that we all think of now as part of the international infrastructure against corruption you were involved in setting up. Fantastic contribution. I wonder if there's anyone from a TI chapter who might like to intervene at this point. Yes, please. Thank you. Could you just introduce yourself too?
I'm Valeria Merino, and I used to be, I'm not in a chapter anymore, but I used to run the chapter in Ecuador for 17 years, and I did a lot of this stuff. So I just want to bring a little bit of a different perspective. My experience in Ecuador was that companies did not have, some of the companies in some of the areas that were strategic in the country, for example, telecommunications and energy, they were not in any prisoner's dilemma. They were a cartel. In fact, they were not letting the government do certain things that the government wanted to do to progress the sector. So every time that the government wanted to do a big project that will change the status quo, they will scream corruption and prevent the government from running any procurement process. So we were having, for example, 2 telecommunication companies. They got at the beginning of the year together and established how much they would charge the Ecuadorians for every minute of cell phone. We paid 48 cents a minute. And they were very happy. One of them ran all the small accounts, and the other ones were the corporate accounts. And they just, were happy making millions of dollars in Ecuador. There was no cell phone service for almost anybody because we couldn't pay for it. Okay? So I think that the Integrity Pact can also be used in a different perspective, which is to help the government do what they want to do and prevent the other guys from stopping the government from doing it. And that's what we did in Ecuador. Because in Ecuador, we decided to use it to, at the most bottom level, the Integrity Pact and all these rules were embedded in the contracting papers and the bidding papers. So it was not something that people signed before. No, they signed them as part of the bidding papers. And we supervise the contracting process in a way that make it completely impossible for anybody to pay anything. Because all these things that they put in contracting processes today, they make impossible for people to know what's going on, were public. All the procurement bases were public in the internet. Nobody had to pay for them because it's the first thing that you make people pay. So nobody else can see the papers. No, all the papers were open. Then there were consultations with everybody, so everybody can say, oh, this company is actually lying because those technicalities are impossible. They can't do that with that amount of money. So, so instead of having one consultant that is paid by somebody to direct the procurement process in that direction, there was no way to do that, and so on and so forth. And this was contractual. So when the company signed anything, this was embedded into the contract, so it was legal. So you could pursue it. And they had to sign a bank guarantee in our name for $100,000. So they misbehave, I can go to the bank and cash it. There had to be some. So, I wanted to say that this can be seen as a different thing because it's not just about these poor guys in the private sector trying to do this and these government people trying to charge them all the time. There is a dynamic in both directions. And I think there's a lot of people in the government that wants to do the right thing, but sometimes they just can't. So you have to see what is the situation in the country. In Ecuador was pretty different. It was not like that. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Thanks so much for sharing that experience. And I think a good reminder that in a way what collective action does is it shakes up a power dynamics, spreads the power out, and then enables you to sort of open things up and change that power dynamics, with the transparency being a key part of that as well. Sabina, you wanted to come in quickly? Great. Let's hear from you quickly, and then we'll go to our other two experts.
Thank you, Liz. As Siemens was mentioned several times, and I'm with Siemens for many years, I thought I should say something. And Peter, you all know that we had a big corruption scandal, right? And that is like 13, 14 years ago. And in order to clean up the company, we started the collective action program in 2009. And one module was that we committed to promote integrity pacts. And we tried to do that on all levels. Sometimes we were successful, sometimes we failed. But the thing was that our understanding was that the Integrity Pact is a prerequisite in order to participate in a public tender. And so we at Siemens tried to sell the Integrity Pact idea to public customers, right, in the energy business or in the infrastructure business. And what happened was that the public customers did not really share our understanding, because some of the public customers would say, what do you want from me? Do you think I'm corrupt or what? So our success in promoting this thing was relatively small, but we participated in many integrity pacts around the world, namely in India, but also in Germany for the German airport Berlin, which was a disaster in itself. 10 years later, right? But I think we really strongly believe in the idea of integrity pacts to make it clear from the very beginning in a public infrastructure project that you stand for clean business and that you are ready to take sanctions if things turn out to be not correct. That is just what I wanted to mention.
That's great, thanks so much. And I think also the common thread, sorry, please do clap, yeah. The common thread actually in all three of these interventions is around the interaction between sort of voluntary commitments and then contractual and legal commitments. So the sort of interaction between those, I think, is pretty critical. Okay, so we've got two more people to hear from. I think Vanessa's going next. So Vanessa Hans, who is the head of private sector at the Basel Institute, who of course have been also doing a lot of work on collective action for many years. Vanessa, you work a lot with the private sector and you see the private sector side of this. Can you tell us how you make the business case to companies to get involved in this kind of thing?
Sure, thank you, Liz. Kind of standing up as well because I think we have a couple of people who are looking at us from over there and online. So thank you so much. Before I answer that question, I was actually kind of interested in knowing who's in the room, because we've been talking about different stakeholders, and just by a show of hands, if anyone's here from the private sector, if you could just raise your hand. All right, a few. Civil society? Government? Okay, so we have a good crowd. And I think that's pretty good as a prelude, because basically, as we've all heard, integrity pacts, but also collective action in general, is really built on that backbone of being a multi-stakeholder engagement. And we've heard a few examples of people pointing fingers and saying, well, private sector, it's the government, they're asking for bribes. And we hear a lot the reverse as well of the private sector. Well, actually, if we want to be part of this public procurement, we don't have a choice. And so when we discussed this briefly with Liz, we're saying, what's the business case there? And I would say it really depends, and I think that's one of the beauty of collective action in general, is that it can be tailored to a specific context, be it a country, a sector, or even smaller than that. We've been doing also a lot of work sometimes with local governments. And to say that the business case depends also on the size of the company. So let's start with the big ones. So we've heard a couple of examples of the good work that Peter has initiated, and I know he's been also quite involved with our founder, Mark Peet, at the Basel Institute. But basically finding some people who are committed and championing this idea of doing the right thing together and getting out of this prisoner's dilemma. So what we hear a lot as well is that, well, it's kind of easy for big companies because they have a compliance department, they have a legal department, they have people out there who are, kind of paid to do that and make sure that the company doesn't get in trouble. And luckily, through the work that has been done over the last couple of years, we've shifted from companies being able to bribe and deduct it from taxes to a situation where actually there are legal implications and quite hefty fines in case things go wrong. But then it leaves also the small and medium enterprises, and we do a lot of work with them in different countries, and there it gets a bit more challenging, and especially in times of COVID, where survival of companies has been quite a challenge, and the compliance element and the ethical element is not necessarily always at the center. So we've been lucky to be working with a couple of organizations around the world, and I'd like to just cite an example of people we work with in Thailand, for instance, where they've been looking at small and medium enterprises and helping them in their compliance journey by helping them access specific markets, but also supply chains. And here it's looking at the public procurement element, which is quite crucial, and I'll get back to integrity pacts in just a moment, but also looking at supply chains of the bigger companies. So in Thailand, for instance, the bigger companies came together into what is known as the Thai Collective Action Against Corruption, and they all got together, and it's been working for quite a couple of years, but then they said, why don't we include our supply chains where the small and medium enterprises are? And why don't we help them by mentoring them and helping them understand what a compliance program is all about and how to shape this up, so at least we as a big company know that our suppliers are doing the right thing and are gearing up, but also helping the smaller companies in their journey, because obviously we all know it's a bit more difficult in terms of resources and capabilities, frankly speaking, sometimes of understanding those topics. So I think there are really good examples out there, and the business case can be access to markets, in this case public procurement, obviously, but also sometimes access to financing. And I think Peter has shared, really the stories of the very beginning, and I think now we're in a very different place in the world where actually there are conditional loan agreements, and we're in situations where people are contractually mandated to change their behavior and the way they're operating and doing business. So I would say the incentives are access to financing, access to markets, and also we're looking at being part of those collective action initiatives and those clubs or islands of integrity. I know there are a lot of words out there, but some of those multi-stakeholder engagements. And I think one other great things about integrity pacts is in the work that we've been doing. We've been obviously been supporters of the integrity pacts, but also integrity pacts can join forces with other types of collective action initiatives. And here I'd like to introduce the high-level reporting mechanism, which is another type of collective action, where we're looking at government buy-in. So in the case of Ecuador listed before, here it's really about governments saying, well, we want to showcase our commitment to integrity, our commitment also to transparency by setting up those high-level reporting mechanisms which can be tailored to a specific procurement process. So I'd like to take the example of Colombia, for instance, where they had an integrity pact on one of the biggest road infrastructure project, several thousands of kilometers of road, but also several tunnels. And they said, well, we'll put integrity pacts in place, but also a high-level reporting mechanism. Because there was a demand from the private sector, but there was also a strong push from the government. And so together, they managed to set this up. And I think, in a way, the high-level reporting mechanism, for those of you who don't know what it is a non-judicial grievance mechanism that allows companies to basically notify any suspicion of unfair business practices and suspicions of corruption, and it gets picked up in this high-level committee that is connected to the highest levels of government, so the government can act quickly on it. When we say quickly, it's a matter of days or weeks, because we all know that if a procurement process gets halted, especially in public procurement, it can sometimes take years. It costs a lot of money to the government, but also to companies. And so we've been really trying to push for the uptake of the high-level reporting mechanism together with the OECD. So I'll let Isabel speak in a moment. But it was really something that also jointly with TI was pioneered, I would say about 15 years ago now, and that also works together. So I think there are a lot of good people out there, a lot of good things being done, and really look forward to also hearing from all of you, because I think it's also a good session today to hear some of the feedback and maybe some of the challenges that you guys are facing out there. So I'll pause for now. Thanks you.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. And actually, you know, with my academic hat on, I think, again, it's interesting to relate this back to the theory and those three conditions. So we heard about selective benefits that you get, access to markets, access to finance, some of the kind of cultural support, empowerment benefits of being in a club. And then we heard more about the monitoring and enforcement thing with the high-level reporting mechanism as a way of raising grievances, which also is a key part of the Integrity Pact standard. So now we're going to Isabel Cane, who is the head of trust in business at the OECD. And Isabel, I think you're going to talk to us a bit more about the high-level reporting mechanism, but also a focus on a really important sector for Integrity Pacts, which is the infrastructure sector.
Thank you, Liz. It's always a gamble what I'm going to talk about. And even though we agreed about 10 minutes ago that I was going to talk about infrastructure, I'm also going to put another lens on it and talk about the future of this space a little bit, given that Peter outlined a history. I will stand up, sorry, because you can't see me so well. The history of anti-corruption, and I think we are at quite an inflection point in terms of where we are as a movement, but also how critical anti-corruption is for some of the global challenges that we're now facing. So if I may, Peter, and I love your idea of the islands of integrity, and I want to think about how we can make it an archipelago, or to sort of join those dots a bit more to get to zero bribery. So what I was sort of thinking about is what is the current context. So Peter outlined that the integrity pacts were the start of a global movement to basically, you know, criminalise bribery and other forms of corruption. And I was reflecting on where the OECD is now, from, you know, the development of the anti-bribery convention to now having a 2021 recommendation revision that actually looks at the supply side. So it does include, I mean, the private sector. It also includes terms like collective action, which weren't there. So I think we're really starting to see a movement where the fight for is corruption a crime is accepted in the international community. But then how do we now move towards working together to create prevention mechanisms really quite seriously by catalysing integrity in the private sector, in governments, through utilising creative solutions put forward by civil society, but also that are put forward by all stakeholders collectively. So we've been working on a lot at the OECD. I'm looking at Julio, who's sitting there. He's the head of integrity and governance. He's the master, is the expert on corruption. But we're working on a lot of things. And one of the things that strikes me is that we look at these global challenges like climate change, and we look at the SDGs, and we look at the reconstruction of Ukraine that will hopefully come up soon. And what do we need for that is infrastructure development. We need it to meet net zero. We have an infrastructure investment gap of $2.5 to $3.5 trillion a year. Like, if we think about that, $2.5 to $3.5 trillion a year to meet the SDGs and climate. This is incredible, and that's not including the figures for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And so we're thinking about that and going, okay, well, that's a huge amount of money that we need to get to a world that we want to live in. And if we start to think about this and we know that, okay, governments can't fund this alone, we need private sector investment, we need capital to come in and invest in good infrastructure. But guess what? Private sector doesn't want to invest in it because of corruption and because of political instability. So then we go, okay, well, we need to solve this again. We need to go back to the table and look at why is it that integrity pacts are not being utilised as much as they were? Why aren't we really addressing this fundamental problem in infrastructure, which is corruption? So what we've been doing is really looking at it, and this is what I'm starting to term as the second wave of anti-corruption, is how do we re-engage with this issue through innovative solutions? And if I may, I'd like to talk about one area that we're doing it, and in it we are reflecting on both the integrity pacts and the high-level reporting mechanisms, and this is through an initiative that the US, Australia and Japan came up with called the Blue Dot Network. It's not the sexiest name until you know the purpose behind it, and then it's really quite gorgeous. But the Blue Dot Network basically looks to certify infrastructure projects around the world by awarding them dots. So again, you have an incentive. You would award them with a dot if they meet the environmental, social, and governance standards or the quality infrastructure standards that we would anticipate, so that an investor wants to invest in that project, right? So they send out a signal, I'm not being corrupt, I'm being environmentally sound, so we will invest with you. It's a fantastic concept. What's really interesting about this for the OECD and for the over 200 executives and civil society organisations we've engaged in this program is that it really does a deep dive on corruption. It looks at procurement, it looks at bribery, it looks at saying you need to have A, B and C in place. It has a set of essential requirements, as was outlined by the integrity pacts, that are really comprehensive. And they don't just look at it in silos. Let's not just look at it at procurement. It looks at it at investment, money laundering, procurement, and then also through construction and operations. So this is, it's quite an incredible new tool that's coming out. We are currently designing it with a lot of you actually in the room, and we certainly invite you to come up to us and engage in that process. But what we've done in the third dot, and this is sort of comes to my second point of how do we scale these solutions? So integrity pacts, amazing. The high-level reporting mechanisms are really critical tools, but how do we bring them back out into the market and incentivise people to engage with them? So what we've done is working with our partners has recommended that these non-judicial grievance mechanisms are actually included as a part of the Blue Dot. So that if you are going to get a Blue Dot, you need to have an integrity pack at this level, right? So we're starting to build this into the international framework again, so within the OECD, but more broadly. So these are some of the strategies that we think help promote anti-corruption, and they incentivise it in a way that both the private sector and governments are looking at it, to really bring in both the private sector investment that is needed and the stability that governments and communities are looking for. So we're actually launching a report on this on Anti-Corruption Day on Friday. So we're very happy to share that with you. It outlines the integrity pacts, the high-level reporting mechanisms within this new sort of global context where we're starting to see the second drive from investors, from construction, engineering and operators around corruption. So I guess this is sort of what we're looking at, and I was thinking about it as you were speaking, you know, this history of 25 years of the anti-corruption movement. This is where we're starting to see the future in terms of really promoting transparency, associating it with access to finance and other areas. I think that's where I was going to leave it. One of the comments, if I may, that I just had on the slides, I think that the concept of the standards is fantastic, and maybe I can take this out to the group. I think the essential requirements are a little bit basic. I think you could push a little bit harder on them. The essential requirements for the blue dot do go a little bit harder and ask for a little bit more. For example, to have an anti-corruption process in place at the project level. So I think what we would like to offer is to have a conversation around aligning the integrity pacts with some of these global frameworks so that if you get an integrity pact, for example, you have an integrity pact in place at the project level, then you're actually already meeting some of the standard for the blue dot, and vice versa, right? So in that way, you really do create that global movement or that sort of collective action behind accountability and transparency at the procurement and project level.
Thanks very much, Isabel. And again, interesting, I think, to see how as this matures, one of the things you need to do is link up different initiatives so that, again, you get more benefit from being involved in them. So, great. We've got some hands coming up. So please, I invite everybody to ask your questions. And we've got here, of course, Peter, Vanessa, and Isabel. We've also got Kaya and Antonio keen to get feedback on the Integrity Pact standard. And we're also really keen to hear about your experiences. So I'm going to take maybe 3 interventions in a cluster, and then we'll hear from people. So there's one here.
Hi, I'm Kaunain Rahman. I work for the Open Contracting Partnership, and I'm always in for a good standard. We have the Open Contracting Data Standard, which has been implemented by more than 50 countries now and 70 institutions. And I think one of the things that I think for me is very striking is about thinking smart about how you change the system and not sort of like go into each of the projects. I think what the integrity pacts have done, and I've worked at Transparency International, and I've had sort of like hands in the guidelines from the 2008, etc., writing those up in the beginning. And what we're thinking at Open Contracting is really thinking about like how you open up the process throughout all of the procurement agencies. I think the integrity pacts have a great opportunity to say, like, look at, well, here's something really tricky, something really naughty. How can we work with the different actors in opening this up? But then you want to really make sure that translates back into the wider procurement system by integrating, you know, I think the Blue Dot Initiative does a great work and sort of like looking at infrastructure and larger projects overall. And I think my question in a way is a little bit, how are you, I mean, you've had it as a question yourself as well, and like how do you see scale happening? Because I think that's the one thing that integrity pacts haven't done sort of like throughout the last years and stuff, like thinking about how to use the data, how to use the information, how do you scale this and make sure it actually feeds back into the procurement system, which I think is the key part of like where you then have change and build that trust. So I think that's a bit my question there. And it seems that there are a couple of initiatives around procurement that are going on. So an offer is, I think, we should probably have a bit of a conversation maybe later in the conference to sort of like make sure we actually ask for the same things at international places as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. Good, interesting question about evidence and learning. I think, was there a question over here? You didn't have a question? No? Okay. Question here from the front row.
I can go there. Okay. I want to also give you another perspective. I come from Transparency International Romania. We implemented integrity pacts in the last years. And listening to you, I think in Romania we don't have a prisoner dilemma, but I think many of the stakeholders in the public contracting have at least two false certainties. The first is that we have rules and oversight mechanisms that work very good. Romania is part of the European Union. That means we do have pretty strong procurement rules, and we do have pretty strong oversight mechanisms. This still doesn't save Romania from being on the same level in the last 20 years in CPI, from being a pretty corrupt country, and from having huge problems, both with corruption and with effective procurement. Because it's not only corruption, Romania suffers from not being able to actually use European funds, because many of the contracting authorities are not actually able to organize proper procurement processes, and this makes them in the position to cancel procurement processes because they are not able to follow all the rules. So the first false certainty that we saw is that the rules and the oversight mechanisms that we have are enough for the procurements to work well and to be clean. The second false certainty, and this is, let's say, sorry, this is the certainty. The first, it's at the level of contracting authorities. The second, it's a certainty at the level of businesses. It's not everybody that thinks that, but if you ask a random business in Romania if they think public procurement is corrupt in Romania, I think 90% of the time, no, I exaggerate, but many of them will say yes, and not only yes, but many of them will say all public procurement processes are corrupt. What we find out in doing a research in Romania 3 years ago was that the more businesses knew about public procurement, because they were involved in public procurement, the less they were drawn to think that all public procurement are corrupt. Because most of the public procurement in Romania is not corrupt. What happens is that the trust in the correctness of the public procurement, it's extremely low. And it's a vicious cycle. Because the trust is extremely low, the competition is low. Because the competition is low, the risks for corruption are low. And we are trying to reverse this cycle. And we find out that actually integrity pacts, one of the things that it's interesting, and we promote integrity pacts for that, is that integrity pacts are adaptable to context and situation. And because of that, what we promoted in Romania, we started integrity pacts in 2015, 2016 by thinking about generating some kind of checklists of having a clean procurement context and procurement processes. And we found it out that we did use them, but they were not really useful. What was useful was to have not only a pledge, the pledge was just the gate to the whole process, but the activities and the monitor in the room to talk with all the participants to the procurement process, to build the trust between them, to actually ensure that the public procurement process and the contract afterwards will be implemented in the public interest. We had situations where the participants, the contracting authorities, and the contractors, the businesses, had dilemmas about the process and if they need to stop it and cancel it or to continue it. And we collectively arrived to the conclusion that it's in the public interest to continue the process by solving the problem, not by stopping it to say, well, there was a possible irregularity. We want to avoid any kind of risk of prosecution or corrections after that. and we stop here, and we stop the investment that was in the public interest. And what the Integrity Pact offered was the monitor to look into the process and to say, well, although there was a risk there, we monitored and the risk didn't actually manifested, so the whole process was okay. And this was building trust within the participants to that specific procurement. But I think by talking about it and publicizing it, it can also raise the trust in the whole system. This is my contribution, and the story from a country that it's, by being a member of the European Union, a bit different from all the other, or many of the other countries where integrity pacts have somehow a different role as well, because they are imposing rules. In Romania, the rules that the pledge itself is imposing are not new and are not beyond what the law is providing, but then the integrity pacts are still extremely valuable for us.
Thanks very much, Irina. Really interesting, again, to hear about how flexible this tool is and how it works differently in different contexts. I've got another question here from the back. I'd like to come to the microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Ernest Mpararo. I'm coming from DRC. I'm working with Transparency International DRC chapter. I want to ask, what can we do to implement Integrity Pact in emergency situation? You know, we got COVID, and almost of fund was been because of lack of procurement in different countries. Like in DRC, we had 2 ministers who has been arrested. So, which way can we implement Integrity Pact in this kind of situation? The second question is, we got a lot of, like in climate change, we have a lot of money which was been given by different countries, by different donors. And in DRC, we had Norwegian, who gave us 5 million to attenuate, to mitigate the climate change in DRC and in Congo Basin, in Congo, Brazzaville, and Cameroon. So, but with this fund, it's already been given to international organizations like World Bank, like FAO, like different other international organizations. So civil society, sometimes they don't even have some information in which way those organizations will make the procurement processes transparent and fair. So our fear is the money which was given to the country is returning to the donors' countries, so people in the ground, we don't know what is happening. So on this kind of situation, in which way can we implement the Integrity Pact? Because we don't have any information with UNDP, we don't have any information with FAO or other international organizations which get this kind of money. In which way can we implement this kind of Integrity Pact?
Thanks very much. Great questions. Any final questions? Okay, one here.
I think I'll just use my projecting voice, so I don't have to do what they...
I think the people online need you to use a mic. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. That just makes the projecting voice more projected. My name is Matt Aubrey. I work for a not-for-profit in the Bahamas called the Organization for Responsible Governance. And the context in the Bahamas is such that government has such the emphasis and power in that structure that we have a burgeoning civil society. So they don't necessarily play that role yet. We don't have the public will to understand, or not understand it, but to put value on a standard. So I'd love to hear from the different perspectives, how do we start from that very formative stage? We do a lot of work in civic and citizen engagement, active citizenship, but how do we start to ensure that there is a call for achieving and managing and monitoring at a level and a standard?
Thanks very much. And we had a question here. Yeah, could you come up to the mic, please? Oh, and the final one there. Okay, great.
My name is Abdonel Doudou. I'm from Haiti. My question is more a demand than a question. In Haiti, we have a context where we are struggling with extreme poverty, insecurity, and all of that bad governance are fueled by corruption. But in civil society organizations, we have been advocating for more than 20 years for a law on access to information, because it is the basic when it comes to using tools like the Integrity Pact and other tools that can help in promoting transparency. The first challenge you get, you can't have access to information. How can the Transparency International and other partners at the global level advocating for transparency could help having the adoption of law to access to information, for access to information as a prerequisite for development programs, grants at international and regional levels, so that it could be an incentive for governments in those countries to finally adopt such law that can help us in our advocating work. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's a really interesting point. What are the sort of preconditions for getting collective action and integrity pacts to work? Lady there in the check jacket. Okay, and then we'll have one really final question from the gentleman down there. Yeah, thank you. Please go ahead.
The lady in the check jacket is Paola Barragan. I'm here with my colleague from the USAID Peru Democracy and Governance Office, and I currently lead a project in Peru funded by USAID called Integrity in Public Investment, Transparency and Integrity in Public Investment and Public Procurement. So what I wanted to more than a question, because I found everybody was saying very interesting things and things that, you know, we all live in different ways, but what I wanted to say regarding sort of the purpose that you had initially requested some feedback from us, and how integrity pacts can be part of broader strategic policy-oriented application and project selection, as well as part of a broader ecosystems for public spending monitoring. And so I wanted to just bring something to the table for your consideration. One thing that I didn't see in your presentation and that our colleague from Open Contracting mentioned is the use of course, open data and data itself, you know, and I think that nowadays you cannot talk about a second standard if you don't have the word in really big writing that says open data, data, use of data. We are in Peru, what we're trying to do, we have these integrity networks, so they're multi-stakeholder sort of forums where in 5 regions where we work, and they use the Integrity Pact methodology. It's voluntary, so it's, you know, they're not the legal construct of the Integrity Pacts. We call them public-private sort of roundtables or technical roundtables, because we want to stress the issue of collaboration. You know, I think one thing that we've learned, you know, in many countries is that it's really, you know, civil society does an amazing work as activists, but the private sector does not work with the same logic. And therefore, when you have activists that, you know, it's important to denounce, but it's also important to contribute to the solution. And we have very specific experiences in each one of the regions where we work in. So we wanted to do broader integrity pacts, and then we decided, okay, no, it's not working because the private sector doesn't want to sit at the same discussion table with the, you know, there's just no trust whatsoever. So in starting to build this trust, we're promoting these collaboration letters where these integrity networks are basically sort of the, you know, they're the, I would say the bridges between one contracting company and the regional government that is managing a public works. And what they do basically is that they just try to bring people to the table, because what happens, you know, some things that can be solved through legal mechanisms, but others just need to be solved, people sitting around the table. So I think that the combination between having sort of a mentality that's less denouncing and more sort of proposing solutions that may or may not be feasible depending on the legal framework on the one hand. And the second hand, using the opening, we've used datathons to open data on public procurement, public works, and engaging youth, engaging, of course, civil society, but also using that information to generate dashboards that then are used by these integrity networks to then have an additional sort of discussion and conversation with the regional governments that we work with. So those are my two.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And sorry, gentlemen down here, could you come up to the microphone, please? And I'm sorry to ask you to keep it short, but we are quite, if we want to hear from the experts, we're quite low on time. Please.
Thank you. I'm Donald O'Leary. I'm with Transparency International. Hi, Peter. Great to see you. I also work with the Partnership for Transparency, another organization founded by Peter. I've been working on integrity pacts for a number of years, and I just wanted to mention some things, particularly in relation to Africa. First of all, we're in the epoch of lots of data. So my interest is in infrastructure, and a standard that's widely accepted now is called the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard. And I'm doing some work in one of the poorest countries in Africa, in Malawi, and they have accepted that as a way of reporting on infrastructure projects. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that combining this with integrity pacts makes integrity pacts even more effective. The second point I'd like to make is when we define corruption, corruption is very linked with human rights. In fact, my knowledge of TI and the history of its being set up is very much linked with Amnesty International. If we look at large civil works contracts, particularly in Africa, one of the major issues that comes up is how the workers are treated. And that is not something that's typically reported on. How many complaints are made by workers in terms of how they are treated in doing large infrastructure projects such as roads? And my suggestion is that we need to think as much about these kinds of issues as actually somebody bribing somebody.
Thank you very much.
Secondly, the last point I'd like to make is not all the countries that are working in Africa would subscribe to something like the blue point standard that has been mentioned. We have to get that information out to contractors from other countries, particularly from large Asian countries that are working in Africa, that we expect everybody to be complying with these standards.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, this was a great session, clearly lots of enthusiasm. I'm going to suggest that we go in reverse order now. So we go Isabel, Vanessa, Peter. And if you could keep it to a couple of minutes and pick the questions that you most want to answer. Antonio, you'd also like to respond? Okay, I will come to you again. I think we haven't got time for more questions, I'm afraid, but please do come and ask afterwards. Otherwise, we won't get a chance to hear from people because some people will have to go to other meetings. Okay, so we'll have 4 interventions. So, Isabel.
So just very quickly, I think that some of a common theme in the questions, I think, points from the DRC and Haiti really does point to looking for local champions. So if you don't have champions in highly corrupt environments, if the government's not listening, if there's not yet a civic space to engage, one of the areas that there is a space to engage sometimes is through multinationals that may want to be working there but can't because that doesn't exist, other civil society organisations, or indeed with international organisations, and I'm really happy to talk after this. So I think finding your champions so that then you can do what the lady whose name I didn't remember but has a beautiful blue cardigan on has said, is then Valeria, thank you, is to find then you create that table of experts. And I think what Peter outlined earlier is, you know, I was just thinking of the courage of you're going to get fired for talking about this issue, you're going to get fired for doing this. And so slowly building up your champions until you have a collective group that then starts to make noise, if you can, within the security of your space, is the advice or the common theme that I would see across some of the comments. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Isabel. Vanessa.
Thank you so much, and really appreciated the inputs as well. And I think one of the common themes that I noted was also the aspect of trust as a foundation for all of the different aspects that have been noted. And one of the important elements of trust as well is communication. And what we've been experiencing as well is, and I think a couple of you have also pointed and alluded to that, is the fact that civil society, the private sector and public sector don't speak the same language. And so we do a lot of work in terms of trying to bridge that gap and building that. And so going beyond, you know, defining what is a high-level reporting mechanism, what is an integrity pact, but just looking at this as trying to find a collective solution and using the term of collective action encompassing all of this. And sometimes it can be just bring people to that table and facilitating those discussions. And there, civil society has a role to play, and we do a lot of work in mentoring as well, because a lot of civil society organizations are advocates and are very strong voices in that sense, but are not necessarily seeing themselves as a facilitator. And I think that's a very different role that civil society can play. And so we do a lot of work on the ground in helping civil society organizations play that role and being that facilitator, bringing people together and trying to understand each other.
Thank you, Vanessa. Over to Peter.
Well, thank you very much. There's such a long list of interesting interventions that I don't want to take too much time in addressing all of them. I want to quickly respond to Valeria's intervention, because she really knows the Integrity Pact very well. In fact, we developed it together from 1993, basically. And I simply want to tell her that, of course, each of the elements of an integrity system, which we are trying to propagate, can be abused. And the fear of promoting a cartel, promoting anti-competitive practices is very close to our mind. Therefore, for instance, these longer-term arrangements in the electric power sector or in the banking sector was chaired by Transparency International, because they wanted to avoid to be seen to conspiring to restrict competition. So we are very much, and this is addressing a little bit the intervention from Haiti and from Panama. We are addressing corruption in a society with a multifaceted systemic approach. So we believe that there are many different elements in an integrity system which have to be strong in order to protect the society. And if you want to start to deal in a situation where the government doesn't support you or some big businesses don't support you, you try to build an understanding between government, civil society, and private sector on which of the elements in the integrity system are weak. And not only create a sort of ad hoc integrity pact for one particular procurement process, but create a multi-stakeholder roundtable, as somebody called it, which I like very much, and establish a dialogue which then can develop over time to a long-term process of reporting together about problems of governance and then finding solutions to these. So I think it's very important that we don't restrict the Integrity Pact just to procurement. Procurement is just one element in the integrity system. So I like OCP very much and their approach. You know, I think this is very good to deal with procurement. But if you really want to change the system, the integrity system in a society, you have to look at many different aspects, including, for instance, the promotion of public access to public information. I mean, you are absolutely right, this is a basic part, and if you look at our corruption perception index, you will see that the countries who have a system of access to information, like the Scandinavian countries, they are always on top of our index, on top of all the others. So in many ways, many of the the feedback we got, we can learn from. But I want to say it is important that if we talk about collective action, we don't only look at ad hoc arrangements to find a solution to one particular road which is being built or one particular power supply system, but we put together the people from government, civil society and private sector to work together and watch where the strengths and weaknesses of the integrity system are. And that integrity system then can be approached together without going out of business as soon as one particular competitive procurement program has been finished. Well, there are so many interesting interventions you have made, but I like very much the proposal to create in Peru, for instance, a round table. I like that term because this is basically exactly what, for instance, Habermas, the famous German philosopher, calls deliberative democracy. So you can define democracy by having elections regularly, you can define it by having checks and balances between institutions and so on. But the deliberative culture of democracy is extremely important. And if you create a deliberation between government, civil society and private sector about weaknesses in governance in whatever sector, in whatever situation, procurement or other thing, then you have made a tremendous step forward. And this is why I'm promoting this, and this is why I'm recommending this to Transparency International as a strong mantra for continuing our fight against corruption.
Thanks very much, Peter. And so, Antonio.
Yeah, just very quickly on the connection between integrity pacts and open contracting data. So I mentioned it in passing. It was among the commitment and activities. I could not dig into it because of lack of time, but of course we do foresee a big role for sort of the connection between integrity pacts and open data. We think that data, of course, like given that the integrity pact is not, it's more like sort of a risk-based tool that should be applied only when it matters the most. The connections there is by using data to actually understand what is happening in the procurement process. And then the integrity pacts, when you identify those trends and red flags, the integrity pacts can answer the question of why that thing is happening and how it is happening. Because compared to open data, the integrity pacts gives the civil society organization access to information that sometimes is not available to the public, and it also allows for this day-to-day relationship with the contracting authority, which is very important, like from both sides to understand what is happening, because many times there are misunderstandings also, and civil society organizations think that public officials could do more, and the other way around. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that the Integrity Pact can also help civil society organizations understand why contracting authorities sometimes do not disclose data. What are the problems there? Whether it's because they do not have the technical capacity, they do not have the political will, and so on. So within the Integrity Pacts, including commitment and activity on open data, can help that process of disclosure. And here I'm speaking mostly about very complex infrastructure projects where you have not only data for proactive disclosure, but also on reactive disclosure. So through the integrity pacts, the monitor can effectuate actually a review of what are the gaps in there and solve them. So that is another way of putting it. And also open data, of course, can also help when you have an integrity pact that lasts until the award of the contract. Then you can complement it for the implementation phase. You can use data in that phase also to engage sort of citizens. Regarding the question of political will, of course, I think it was like the issue from Peru. That's why I stress that it's very important here to measure the benefits of the integrity pacts, to find some common indicators. What's very important is that when there is like this collaborative process of designing of the integrity pacts, that there are clear expectations from all stakeholders of what everyone is getting. If we limit the integrity pacts to the integrity pledge, of course, that remains unclear. But when you do include activities, for example, compliance systems, whistleblowing mechanisms, something concrete that companies get out of it, the situation changes. Another suggestions here would be also to connect the integrity pacts to policy reform platforms. For example, the Open Government Partnership, it's a good way of sort of embedding the integrity pacts in a broader framework for reform. And indeed, in the early 2000s, this approach was adopted mostly in Latin America, and that was where the integrity pacts had the most impact, like, and also cleaning up procurement markets, changing the behavior and the culture among participants. So if you can apply it as one-off initiative, but then you cannot expect the impacts to go beyond the project level. But when you do this in a systematic manner, that is when you understand sort of how.
Antonio, thank you very much. We are going to close now, but there's clearly so much more to talk about. Please, I also just want to plug that Antonio and Kaya would like feedback on the Integrity Pact standards, so please do give them feedback. If you've still got burning questions, come and talk to our speakers in the break. But in the meantime, thank you all for your questions, and thank you very much to all of our excellent speakers for the great contribution.